right, good afternoon. You made it to topic number 4. So please go ahead, grab your seats, settle in, and we'll go ahead and get started. So topic number 4, we're bringing it home. This is how we implement change into your department. We begin this topic by exploring the conversation on workers' compensation. And for that, we've brought in 4 different partners to be able to discuss this really important issue about firefighter cancer and workers' compensation. So on our panel today is Attorney Benjamin Helquist, Casey Grant, Captain John Gulotta, and our own Vice President Rocco Salvatori from our Florida Professional Firefighters Association. Do we have an order? I'm going to go first. Okay. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Casey Grant, who will moderate our session on workers' compensation.
Thank you, Alberto. So I just want to start. I'm going to try to be as quick as I can to get out of the way of our 3 gentlemen here who are really the main show of this panel on this important topic. I'm the moderator because I've been outspoken saying we need to address this. We need to address this. And let me just circle back and speak to all the fire service members that are here and online, and just say we're living a gifted life with our medical researchers in that we are lined up with them. We've evolved all that we're doing here in this big way so that we can have the blind faith we need, that they're going to do what we need to get the evidence to bring forward this information that is so critical to this topic. And where I'm going with this is there's an important endpoint, among others, and that's presumptive cancer laws and legislation, as well as workers' comp and so forth. And there's a gap because we don't have that same blind faith. We're back to, we struggle. And I know personally, I look at everything going on between states and provinces, and I have a lot of questions. There's a lot of moving parts here. So on this important topic, we know we need to address this more, and we'll do so going forward in other venues and so forth. But for now, we have this short bit, and I do want to yield the time over to our 3 individuals representing us here today. But I just want to add one last important point. You're going to hear certain themes in terms of the complexity of this topic, the diversity between jurisdictions and so forth. But another important theme, if we seriously want to address some of these topics like workers' comp, we need to be unified. And I just want to reflect at, we know the IAFF is got that political clout to have full frontal assault, if I can speak in military terms, in terms of addressing legislative activity and so forth. But I want to step back and say the importance of everybody being unified on this. And we heard this morning for the volunteers with Chief Quinn, as well as Chief Burnswig, on the importance of working together. This is one of those topics. We have to work together. And for the volunteers, it's just amazing how I keep running into people who, among the many other things they do, they are lawyers, they are city councilors, they are legislators in some cases. And you can see this with the Congressional Fire Service Institute, those congressmen and women and senators who are involved with the fire service in some way, shape, and form. So we need everybody to work together, and so I just want to offer that unified perspective. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Captain John, and you can turn it over to the others. And this is our slides.
Perfect. Well, good afternoon. Sorry, I'm trying to see if this thing's going to... All righty. So my name is John Gulotta. I'm the Health and Safety Captain for Tucson Fire Department, and you're probably wondering, why the heck am I up here with these smart people? And it's really to give you a fire service perspective of lessons learned, because back in 2013, Tucson Fire Department had a presumptive cancer. Arizona had presumptive cancer back in 2013, and actually a few years prior to that. And we had our first presumptive cancer. Firefighter Tom Quizna was diagnosed with cancer, and he was denied his presumptive cancer. And the reason they said that they denied his cancer was because of a couple of factors. Number one, they said, and remember this is 2013, there wasn't enough research or good quality research back then to prove firefighters are being exposed at a fire. And we thought that was pretty interesting. I mean, this is right after Dr. Daniels just published how the rate of cancer was so high in the fire service. They also said that our fire cause investigator, Tom Quiznow, had to prove or show which fire did he get cancer on. Now, I don't have a lot of letters behind my name, but that's a pretty stupid statement. How can you say which fire you got cancer on? And then the third thing is they didn't understand what latency is, and I'll kind of talk about that just in a minute. So when we found out he was denied, we needed to figure out the first piece, and that's the exposure part. So we reached out to the University of Arizona and said, okay, we need to figure out exposure. So for the next 3 years, we followed firefighters after fires, and we collected biologicals. Kind of like what Jamie and Derek were talking about, and Jeff, we collected pee after fires. So for 3 years, I was known as the pee guy. So yeah, but I'm glad there's other people now doing it, so maybe we can become the pee squad or the pee crew or something and get some t-shirts or something made out of it. But as we figured out and we proved exposure, so go figure, right? After 3 years, we looked for toxicants. We found these toxicants in our urine after fires, and they weren't there before, and we proved exposure. Well, during that 3-year time period, the University of Miami, University of Arizona, NIOSH started putting together the FFCCS, which was, I call it the Hall of, what is it called? The Hall of Superheroes or whatever it is. And they put all the best people together, right? NIOSH, I mean, you've heard all the people here today that are truly the scientists behind it, and they understand it. But they started not only looking at exposures, but they said, what happens with that exposure, right? And we heard Derek talk about epigenetic changes, right? So you go from exposure to that epigenetic change that turns into cancer. And in that time period, there's a thing called latency, right? Your exposure doesn't necessarily happen today. It could happen today, but it could show up 3 to 30 years down the road. So one of the things that we did wrong in Arizona when we got our presumptive cancer is we treated it just like an injury. We basically took, sprained knee out, and we put in cancer into it, and we figured it was going to fly that way. And unfortunately, it didn't, because with a sprained ankle or a sprained knee, you have a sentinel event. We know when it happened. But with cancer, it wasn't. So we couldn't treat it the same way, and that's why the denial was there. So as I talk about this, my biggest point on this is that it has to be, the foundation has been set. All these researchers over the last 8 years have created not only proven exposure, have come up with what is happening to us epigenetically, and that cancers are happening with this, that we have to create that foundation, and that's what's been done over this last 8 years. So they're going to talk about, the next two gentlemen are going to talk about how each state's a little bit different, right? They interpret what presumptive actually means. Their definition of presumptive is different in every single state, which I'm not sure how that happens. And everybody has different workers' comp rules and laws, which is very unique to that state. But the foundation of science is there, right? That is what has been set. And every state, it doesn't matter if you're California or Florida, Maine or Southern Arizona, that science is set. That is where you start with. I get a lot of asks from fire departments saying, we don't know how to navigate this. And I tell you that, and as Casey alluded to, is that it has to be a collaborative effort. You have to have the right people together, starting with that foundation of science. You have to get trusted lawyers who understand, not all lawyers understand, workers' comp and workers' comp law, and also a friend of the fire service. We need that kind of collaboration. And as well as the union, as Casey said also, is that our union folks know how to get the attention of the legislation. So we take the science, we take the service, right, fire service, the science, the lawyers, and we give it over to this union who does the heavy lifting, and they take it up to the legislation. But it's not just take it to them and say, this is what you have to do. We have to educate them. We have to get them to understand what exposure is, how exposures happen, what is epigenetic, and what is latency, so that they can make a true good determination of presumptive. That's what needs to be. That's the most important piece of this. It's not working too well on me, but the fire service has to participate in every single phase of this. We have to help the researchers with the data. We have to help the lawyers understand fire service, and we have to assist the unions in order to push this forward. We are delivering way too many folded flags to our families. And it's horrible to say that, but we have to stop. Does anybody have an idea why presumptive is so important to happen right away? Why do we need it to happen as soon as we find out that the person is diagnosed? Right? It starts your care right away. It starts your care in the best opportunity. Now, we may have health insurance, but you are limited to whatever your health insurance will provide you, and your co-pays, and your own time off until workers' comp steps in and accepts it. But if they don't accept it, or they do accept it, you get to be able to choose a doctor, choose the right doctor, choose the best doctor depending upon your cancer, not what your personal health insurance chooses for you. So it's extremely important not only to have this foundation set, the language is correct, and your union takes it up and educates our legislative people. This is how we're going to be successful in a presumptive cancer. And every single state has to do this. You can't say, well, this is what Arizona is doing, or Florida, or New York, or even California. You have to have these collaboration of these people in your own state. So next I'm going to hand it over to Ben Helquist, and he's going to talk about some of the legal questions and explain some of that for you.
Thanks, John. And thanks to all of you for coming and sitting for a panel on workers' compensation on a Friday afternoon. That takes true bravery. So I'm glad you're here, and I'm very honored to be here presenting to you. I find it really helpful to kind of go back to basics in terms of, is this working? Yeah. In terms of what we're actually talking about when we're talking about workers' compensation. You probably already know this. I get it. However, as has been mentioned a couple of times, there are at least 50 jurisdictions in the United States, plus a couple other territories, and if we're going international, even more. So as a result, there is no one-size-fits-all for workers' comp. So rather than try to give any specific advice, don't take legal advice from a panel, from an LA attorney in Florida, but rather than give any specific advice, I want to give you a survey essentially of what we're talking about. And the idea being that with all of our collective knowledge in this half an hour, you can be on the lookout as a stakeholder in the fire service in whatever capacity to try to make it easier and better for those diagnosed to get the benefits that they ought to get. So when we talk about benefits, we are talking about just a few basic things which are pretty universal, though they certainly vary in the way that they're provided state by state. Medical coverage. Sometimes that means using one's own private health insurance and getting reimbursed for copays and other expenses. That's questionable. There's legal questions about that. Other times that means going through a state's workers' compensation system. And if you know anything about that, you know that often it is not the best care, which is unfortunate. It's not the best care for a couple of reasons. The first and foremost is that most doctors aren't interested in going through workers' comp. Too much paperwork. Their offices aren't designed for it. The second is that everything typically has to be pre-authorized by an insurance or administrator who's neither a doctor nor a lawyer, but makes legal and medical decisions all day. So that's the first aspect of workers' comp. The second, wage replacement, right? As you treat, if you become incapacitated, you still need to get a paycheck. What a more critical time than when you're battling cancer to make sure you can put food on the table. That is an integral part, and should be an integral part, of every state workers' compensation system. Again, it varies, and the amount of money that you get often varies. I'll give you some examples, and I should mention here that we're sort of fortunate. I'm from California, John's from Arizona, Rocco's from Florida, so we kind of get not only a geographic continuum across the states, but also different political climates, and so what we're going to try to present to you today is pictures of each of those states so you can understand the way that this can work in your own jurisdiction and perhaps make positive change. The other species of benefits, permanent disability, so money because you got cancer, that exists in a number of jurisdictions. Disability retirement is a huge thing for those in public safety. That can be a tax consequence brought to you by the tax code. It's a good one, right? Half or more of your retirement becomes untaxable as a disability retirement. And then if you are young and you're not vested within whatever retirement program you've got, it can accelerate your retirement. So if you can no longer work due to your cancer, you're fortunate to be able to get the retirement early. And then in some jurisdictions, as we'll see in Florida, there's sometimes a lump sum provided. Here's some cash, go ahead, do what you can with it. So with that in mind, oh, it disappeared, I don't know, okay. Okay. So you've heard the word presumption thrown around a lot. Let's just make sure we understand what it is. Presumption is a rule of law that permits a court to assume a fact is true until contrary evidence proves otherwise. All right, so if you get cancer in California, then that cancer is industrial until your employer's attorney can prove that it's not. And there's very special and limited ways to do that. Presumptions vary from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The variance really comes down to a number of different things. But before I jump into it, I'll make sure we understand the point. If a firefighter's cancer is presumed, he or she no longer has to prove it. And as you know, particularly the medical professionals in the room, it is hard to prove something that occurs after a culmination of exposures to carcinogens. It's very difficult. We get more and more research and data, but reaching a legal standard of proof, typically probable, meaning 51% or greater, that's hard to do. And from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, you can get even higher standards or burdens of proof, which is next to ridiculous, and I'm sure Rocco will kind of touch on, in some jurisdictions, next to impossible. So in order for a presumption generally to occur, you have to have the criteria to trigger the presumption. Talk about some of that in a moment. The burden shift then occurs to the employer, and then the employer has an opportunity to rebut the presumption. If they don't rebut it, the cancer is deemed compensable, and workers' compensation benefits go to the ill firefighter. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the qualifying criteria to trigger the presumption really do vary state by state. In California, there are none. You just need to be a professional or volunteer firefighter. You don't have to have worked for a certain period of time. If you get cancer, it's automatically deemed work-related until proven otherwise. The other types of qualifying criteria, of course, the types of cancer. Most jurisdictions only select those cancers that have some connection to carcinogens typically, that a firefighter is typically exposed to. California doesn't. Any cancer is deemed compensable right off the bat. Time on the job, pre-employment physical and medical history, age, and then to some extent a documented carcinogenic exposure, various reporting data sheets, things of that nature. They are sometimes required just to trigger the presumption. And then, of course, we have what I call semi-presumptive jurisdictions. Alabama is a good example. So a presumption, as we've talked about, is a shifting of the burden. In Alabama, you have to show off the bat that you had an exposure to those type of carcinogens that are reasonably linked to the cancer that manifest. That's already getting halfway there, right? You've already done proof just to trigger what is a presumption. And not singling out Alabama, it's in different jurisdictions around the states, but you have to be careful when you look at the legislation to see what exactly has to be proven before you get the benefit of not having to prove the cancer. So with that in mind, let me just give you a rundown on California. Just one second. Okay, so we're very fortunate. Full salary is awarded under Labor Code 4815 California. It's untaxed via the tax code. It can go for up to an entire year. Thereafter, there's a more typical temporary disability benefit, 2/3 of one wage. And then once the firefighter recovers, hopefully, if there's any permanent disability, he or she receives indemnity for that permanent disability. And then, of course, if they don't recover and they have a permanent work restriction, then they qualify typically for a disability retirement in the state's various retirement associations. The presumption itself, I've touched on this, but all cancers are deemed industrial immediately, even those that are kind of disassociated with any carcinogenic exposure. So that's a meaningful thing. I don't know why this keeps on timing out. But it can be rebutted, right? And the biggest way, at least in California, that a cancer that is presumptive gets rebutted is via the latency period. Even if the science is kind of soft, gives a range, if it is shown that there is a date range, how many years it takes for the mutation to occur, and you weren't working as a firefighter, then even that can take out the California presumption. It's worth mentioning that at least in California, there is no particular showing as to exposures, any specific exposures, that's required before the presumption kicks in. Any known carcinogenic exposure of any type, as defined by the IARC monographs, qualifies. Doesn't have to be related to the cancer that has been diagnosed. That's not the case everywhere. If you have to pair up your carcinogenic exposure with those the type of cancer that you have under the science, then again, as I've mentioned, it's not quite the sort of presumption that is helpful because we know there's variations. And we also know that it's hard to track carcinogenic exposure. So I could talk for a long time. I want to turn it over. I think John or Rocco, however you guys want to do it. The next one is Arizona, if you want to give a breakdown, and then Rocco can do his. Okay?
So I talked about at 2013 when we had 5 cancers and they were being denied. After we got done with our study with University of Arizona and some of the changes, it's not coming up on the screen. Some of the changes that they did, our union and our researchers like Dr. Burgess went back up to Phoenix and they re-lobbied and they changed a lot of things. We went from 5 to 6 cancers to 21 cancers. We also explained to them and got them to understand what latency is, and we now have 15 years after retirement to put in a claim or up to the age of 65. It's a huge jump, which means that they're learning. They've educated and they understand it. Now, some of the other obvious caveats that California doesn't have is you have to be a firefighter for 5 years and some other things. But as you can see, each state is completely different, and you have to have the right group of people in order for it to be successful. I think Arizona is pretty successful. As you can see, California sounds really successful, and I think you'll hear from Florida and the success on that.
Thank you. So to compare to the other 2 examples you've heard, Florida does not have a firefighter cancer presumption or occupational cancer in the traditional sense. We actually tried that for a number of years. Our battles for firefighter cancer coverage in Florida took the better part of 2 decades. And we had this toxic exposure statute that still remains in the workers' comp system that basically says, I won't bore you with reading it, but basically says that you have to know the toxin you were exposed to, the level you were exposed to it, when you were exposed to it, and then prove that it caused your cancer. So I see some head shaking. You know how that was going, right? So in Florida, we attempted to get that changed. We attempted to work within the workers' compensation system, and then being a member-driven organization, we realized that our members didn't want treated for cancer in the workers' compensation system. In Florida, our work comp system is what I will call less than ideal because we're in mixed company. And so what we did is developed an alternative system. We looked to Colorado, who does something similar, and I believe the Carolinas and Georgia have similar systems now. Whereas we did not take away the ability for a firefighter to apply for workers' compensation benefits, even though those benefits are almost impossible to obtain. But a firefighter has this alternative system, which we call firefighter cancer coverage in Florida. And so there's five different categories of benefits. Upon diagnosis, with some qualifying criteria, the firefighter has to have been on the job 5 years. The firefighter cannot have secondary employment that has been proven to have a higher rate of cancer than firefighting. I don't know if there is a job like that, maybe like asbestos removal or something. I've yet to hear of that provision invoked by an employer. But once they qualify, a firefighter upon diagnosis of 21 cancers would get a $25,000 payment, would be eligible for copay, coinsurance, and deductible reimbursement by the employer, so there's no out-of-pocket costs. Additionally, leave time would be covered as if the cancer were a line-of-duty injury, and then disability and death benefits according to whichever retirement system you are in. And like I said earlier, when I addressed on behalf of the FPF, the law has stood up in court a couple of times already. We have a few other cases going now, but largely our firefighters are being treated well under this system. Could there be more and better benefits available through the work comp system? Yes, but they're almost impossible to get. So that's how we ended up where we're at. I would not recommend this system if you have a robust and healthy work comp system in your state. And by no means speaking in favor of it for, anybody to take back home and say, let's do this instead. If you remember the movie we all watched for elevator rescue training, Speed, sometimes you have to shoot the hostage, right? And that was what we did. I hate to make light of something so serious, but we were in a situation where we weren't going to get firefighters treated with the respect and dignity in the system they deserved, so we created an alternative system.
These things, oh, yeah, I want to jump in really fast because we can go to the panel here, and I didn't know these worked. It's way better to present at the table. Now, what's amazing to me, what Rocco's described is, we know the political climate in Florida, and I won't make no judgments being made, but the fact that the employee rights in the state may be a little bit different than other jurisdictions. What's really neat about what you did is you used the political capital and the fact that everyone likes firefighters, and you went to the legislature and you carved out a system that is far superior to regular workers' comp. And sometimes, that last-ditch effort is it's remarkable. I think it's done a lot better, particularly, you told me before the panel, but something like 2 or 3 cancers were deemed industrial in Florida ever prior to this carve-out, right? Prior to this alternative system. So that right there is a really good example of when you have various forces that might be working against you, a good way to make it work for the firefighter.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And are there any questions from the audience? And I have no way to know if there's anything on the virtual side, so I'll defer to the hosts. And I do see at least one person coming up. There is a last slide, and if you're able to put it up, it's just some additional resources. You got to be aware that there are places you can turn in just a general sense within IAFF and NVFC and IAFC, as well as there's one, we put it as an example, one NPR article, but I don't know about you, my head spins on all the moving parts here, and I'm continually looking for guidance in terms of, wait a minute, well, what's good, what's not good, and trying to understand that. And I look over my shoulder and I ask Alex Forrest, the president of the Winnipeg Local 867, or somebody to try to get that guidance. But we don't quite have this institutionalized yet to have that kind of mechanism that we can all lean on. So let's go to first this mic right here, Jeff.
Hey. Great. So this isn't so much for the experts up there, but more for the folks out here in the audience. Make sure you know your state's laws. And just because it's called a presumption, don't presume for a second that you're going to be covered. I'm from California, and I know the story that Mr. Helquist just described about how great California's law is. How many folks are actually approved for that? We have 3 terminal cancers right now. One guy is lucky enough to have it. We had a 35-year guy here just actually still going through treatment. Prostate cancer. We've heard it before. Prostate cancer is one of those cancers that firefighters have a higher likelihood of getting. Had nothing rebuttable other than the fact that he was 50. They'll deny you all the way. Not every department. Just know your state's laws. Don't presume you're going to get covered. And I know that John or Captain Gulotta had mentioned the importance of getting that workers' comp started right away. And I advocate for our local, and oftentimes we say, don't file for workers' comp. Try to get your days covered and go to your doctor or the best doctor you can find. Because a workers' comp doctor, unless you've filed for a specific doctor to be your advocate, somebody's going to make decisions about keeping you alive or not. You might not even, he doesn't even know you. And they're making big decisions about your treatment in the future. So that's just my take.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And before we go to this microphone, I don't know if you'd like to respond. I've just asked that you keep it relatively succinct.
I'll be fast. Jeff's right. Even in a state like California, where every cancer is presumptive, there will always be an initial denial from whomever administrates for a given agency. I can't say with specificity, but that tends to be the case everywhere. It's risk management. You got to deny it and make them work for it. So that's what they do.
Okay, let's go to this microphone here.
I don't know if this question will be more for y'all or our IAFF representative back here. I've been working with State of Texas Workman Comp and line of duty death benefits. And I'm just wondering, is there any future in PSOB death benefits for cancer?
And I don't know if anybody up here would like to respond to that. That's a great question, though, in the connection with the public safety officer benefits, PSOB. It's a great question. So, okay. We'll defer a couple of mics here.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I'll just, from the IFS perspective, PSOB right now is just covering line of duty deaths. And the only thing that they have added for PSOB benefits were the COVID deaths. We were able to get that through the Ryan White Act, and we pushed that through right away. So anybody dying, they do get the PSOB. We looked at cancer claims, and what we're trying to say with the PSOB benefit is that everybody should put in for a PSOB benefit. We want to overwhelm sometimes the system to say, hey, these are the deaths we are receiving from cancer, and would the Department of Justice, who runs that program, would they switch? But we have not got there yet, David, and thank you for the question. We have that a lot on that, and we have not got to the cancer deaths. I think that they're frightened by the numbers, but I think the numbers are what's showing why we need it at the same time there too. So we're still working on that PSOB. It's a tough thing. It's the federal government. It's tough to change, but we have brought that up before in the past there too.
So Kevin?
Thanks, Casey. Kevin Rojecki, Washington State. Before I cared about health and safety, I cared more about political action and politics, and kind of what Brother Hughes is talking about. We had the same problem in Washington State, and the way we dealt with it was let the trial lawyers handle it for us. And so basically we created in 2007 a provision in the court system, or in the court statutes, that if somebody challenges it, i.e. the state or the self-insured, and they lose, then they're on the hook for the attorney fees. So that's a way to handle that situation, and pretty much almost every one of ours are going through. So, handle it that way, the court side, rather than the presumptive side.
Okay, great, thank you. And I don't know if anybody wants to respond between, but we have one more here. And I don't know if there's a trap door up here or how you want us to wrap up, but I know we're, okay, please.
I just had a quick question for Rocco. First of all, extremely grateful for all the work that went into getting this over, 20, 30 years past. I think you would agree there's room for improvement in the bill. Some of the things we're seeing, that I've personally seen, is the payout of the lump sum. Some people are getting taxed on it, some aren't. Definitions of things like skin cancer, it's listed as invasive, but some people are getting it covered by their doctor saying it's invasive and others aren't. It has to meet certain requirements, they're saying. So do you see this going into future legislation to get improved? I know some of the ambiguity is probably a little bit by design, but do you see that going forward, adding more things to it or refining it?
Thank you. So to your point on the different firefighters with similar situations being treated differently, we are aware of that, and what always seems to be at the root of it is the insurer that the employer has chosen to cover the benefit, right? So in Florida, the employer's on the hook for these benefits. However, they do have the option of obtaining insurance to cover it. And so a lot of calls that come across my desk are that I called my HR director and said I have cancer. They told me to call this insurance company, and the insurance company told me to pack sand, and my employer said, well, I guess you're not getting any benefits. And they don't understand that they're on the hook if they hire a crummy insurance company. So that's thing one. Thing two, I do think that as more data becomes available, we'll absolutely be aggressive in trying to expand the benefits. Thank you.
Okay, we have two more people at the mics. We'll go over here first. And I'll just ask that you keep things as short as you can. Thanks.
Thank you so much again. Really appreciate your time. I'm one of the family medicine doctors with the San Antonio Fire Department, and I'm wondering how can I best write letters of support for my patients and my firefighters when they do get diagnosed with cancer and they get rebutted off the bat?
I'd like to answer it. So know the operative language for the burden of proof in your jurisdiction. What's the magic phrase, right? In California, if you want to prove something, it must be to a degree of reasonable medical probability. So, for example, if you have a presumption, knowing the presumption law is good too, but if you think perhaps that your patient might activate the presumption and be able to take advantage of it, great. But if you also think that the cancer was probably caused by his or her years of exposures, write that in there too, right? Be careful with the language, and it may help to also bulletproof it in a sense. If the latency period, for example, is perfectly in line with the period of this individual's career, put that in there as well.
Great, thank you. And we'll come over here, you're the caboose.
Okay.
So,
I have a suggestion, or I guess a question or something that maybe from the doctors could help out. But one of the hardest things with workman's comp is finding a doctor to testify on your behalf. So I've been dealing with that for 7 years now in Arizona, and there's 6 other firefighters right now that are on the same boat as I am. One of the hardest things that we come up on is finding a doctor to testify on our behalf. Insurance companies, they're finding their doctors, they're paying their doctors tons of money, so they're having no problem in saying, no, it's not approved, right? So if we could come up with something with some of the doctors that around the country or something that we could call and say, hey, can somebody testify on my behalf? You know, so something like that. I think that's been one of the hardest struggles that I've seen, at least in Arizona, and talking to firefighters from Colorado and a couple other places. So just something to throw out there.
and I'd like to defer to the panel to end it, but I just want to say thank you for that, because that is spot on what I was reflecting on at the very beginning, is that we do not have the resources like we do on the blind faith of who do we turn to. And I've had that same struggle, and really trying to line up the folks, which seems so easy for others to do, but we can't seem to do it so easily. And that I find extremely frustrating. So I don't know if you have any final words on this as we close up.
Well, sure. I can tell you really quickly how we solved that problem in California. You can't get a medical professional to testify in trial. It's not permitted. They have to write a report, and that report has to be paid for by the employer's insurer or administrator. So not only did we shift the burden, but the cost got shifted as well. So that's an answer. Plus, remember, if your presumption law is good enough, and it literally just requires recognizing the presence of cancer and some level of carcinogenic exposure, doesn't take an oncologist, doesn't take a rocket scientist. It's just any sort of qualified individual who can note that in a report, and if that report's admissible as evidence, then it solves a big problem. That said, though, great to see as many physicians and medical professionals willing to give their time and efforts on this, and that will always be a necessary feature in workers' comp.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you to our panel. That was a lot packed into that 30 minutes. Thank you.